Let's try that again. Hi, good evening. I'm your host for the evening, Dr. Matthew Shear, board member of UMIAC. And tonight's service is, that's it. Sorry. Pardon me. Welcome to the UMIAC third Wednesday Vesper service. Tonight's preacher is me. It's called A Tincture of Time, sponsored by the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council, as you can see on the slide, spelled UUMUAC and pronounced UMIAC. I hope you'll join us next month for our third Wednesday Vespers service on October 18th. It'll be a panel of UMIAC luminaries. The subject will be Whither UMIAC, now that our founder and chairman emeritus, the Reverend Dr. Finley Campbell, has passed. If you got a Zoom link for this service, you'll get one from me as the date approaches. If not, you can go to umiac.org, or you can send me an email, and we'll get you on our email list. It is the mission of the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council to carry out and foster anti-racist and multiracial unity activities both within and outside the Unitarian Universalist Association through education, bearing witness, and other actions, and expansion of our membership both within and outside the walls of our congregations. We also seek to defend our UU principles against those who would seek to undermine them. And our vision is that we envision our congregations, denomination, and society as not being colorblind, but color appreciative, as judging and treating members of the world's rank and file by the content of their character, not the color of their skin or cultural heritage, and as treasuring diversity in the text of the beloved community. We call this vision multiracial Unitarian Universalism. And this is the prize, as you can see in the illustration, for the unity of the light and dark-skinned peoples of the world. And with that, I will light our chalice. Such as I am brandishing here. And nothing fancy tonight. I just light this chalice and hope that its light may illuminate us on our way to truth and that better world we seek. And with that, it is time for our opening hymn, which is number 6 in the hymnal, Just as Long as I Have Breath.
You're muted, Matt.
Yes, sorry. I really like that version, especially the graphics seem perfectly suited to a Vesper's service. And with that, I'm going to start with a reading. It's actually, I'm combining two different things so it'll have better continuity. Two articles that were in the Washington Post a couple of years ago. And Joan is putting the links in the chat if you want to read them in their original. It is the story of Derek Black. Derek Black was reared in the cradle of white supremacy. His godfather and mentor was David Duke, and his father, Don, a former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard and a founder of a popular hate website, Stormfront. By age 10, Black had built a children's website featuring racist and anti-Semitic songs and games that attracted more than 1 million visitors. Later, he launched a 24-hour online radio network, and 5 days a week, he hosted a show in which he peddled racial pseudoscience and advocated for a whites-only country. But when he took up studies at New College, Florida's 4-year liberal arts honors college, his thinking slowly began to change. In speeches and on the radio, he continued to preach white separatism and anti-Semitism. But at school, he befriended classmates of Peruvian and Jewish backgrounds. His double life was exposed when a senior working on his thesis discovered him in a file of white extremists. The student posted links to Black's articles and radio show on the school forum, sparking a campus-wide controversy that unfolded as Black was vacationing in the Alps, meeting with David Duke, his godfather. A few friends from the previous year emailed to say they felt betrayed, and strangers sometimes flipped him off from a safe distance on campus. But for the most part, Derek avoided public spaces, and other students mostly stared at him or left him alone, even as their speculation about him continued on the forum. Here are some samples. Maybe he's trying to get away from a life he didn't choose. He chooses to be a racist public figure. We choose to call him a racist in public. I just want this guy to die a painful death along with his entire family. Is that too much to ask? I'd like to see Derek Black respond to all of this. But gradually, a new way of thinking had begun to emerge for Derek, or had begun to emerge, on this bulletin board. Some said, ostracizing Derek won't accomplish anything. Another said, we have a chance to be real activists and actually affect one of the leaders of white supremacy in America. That is not an exaggeration. It would be a victory for civil rights. Who's clever enough to think of something we can do to change this guy's mind? One of Derek's acquaintances from that first semester decided he might have an idea. He started reading Stormfront and listening to Derek's radio show. Then, in late September, he sent Derek a text message. What are you doing Friday night? He wrote. Matthew Stevenson had started hosting weekly Shabbat dinners at his campus apartment shortly after enrolling in New College in 2010. He was the only Orthodox Jew at the school, which had little Jewish infrastructure. So he began cooking for a small group of students at his apartment each Friday night. Matthew always drank from a Kiddush cup, and he said the traditional prayers, but most of his guests were Christian, atheist, Black, or Hispanic, or some combination of all of those. Anyone open-minded enough to listen to a few blessings in Hebrew. Now, in the fall of 2011, Matthew invited Derek to join them. He decided his best chance to affect Derek's thinking was not to ignore him or confront him, but simply to include him. Maybe he'd never spent time with a Jewish person before, Matthew remembered thinking. It was the only social invitation Derek had received since returning to campus, so he agreed to go. The Shabbat meals had sometimes included 8 or 10 students, but this time only a few showed up. Let's try to treat him like everyone else, Matthew remembered instructing them. Derek arrived with a bottle of wine. Nobody mentioned white nationalism or the forum out of respect for Matthew. Derek was quiet and polite, and he came back the next week, and then the next, until after a few months, nobody felt all that threatened, and the Shabbat group grew back to its original size. They were both still wary of each other. Derek wondered whether Matthew was trying to get him drunk so he would say offensive things that would appear on the forum. Matthew wondered whether Derek was trying to cultivate a Jewish friend to protect himself against charges of anti-Semitism. But they liked each other, and they started playing pool at a bar near campus. Some members of the Shabbat group gradually began to ask Derek about his views, and he occasionally clarified them in conversations and emails throughout 2011 and 2012. Derek was becoming more and more confused about exactly what he believed. Sometimes he looked through posts on Stormfront, hoping to reaffirm his ideology, but now the message threads about Obama's birth certificate or DNA tests for citizenship just seemed bizarre and conspiratorial. He stopped posting on Stormfront. He began inventing excuses to get out of his radio show, leaving his father alone on the air each morning trying to explain why Derek wouldn't be calling in. He was preparing for a test. He was giving those liberal professors hell, except sometimes what Derek was really doing was taking his kayak to the beach so he could be alone to think. He had always based his opinions on fact, and lately his logic was being dismantled by emails from his Shabbat friends. End of story. And at this time, I would just like to mention, admission is free, but you can proffer an offering if you want, or become a dues-paying member of UMIAC for just $30 a year. And you can go to umiac.org and see how to do that. And you'll see it's a Section 501c3 organization, so that's a good thing, right? Okay, back to our service. As I said, this is called a Tincture of Time. I think that title will become explanatory. So I see the story of Derek Black as validation that the principles of liberal religious faith have the power to move even a committed white nationalist. It doesn't matter to me that Matthew Stevenson is an Orthodox Jew and not a UU. Maybe he would use different terms, but what I see in what he did is an application of several UU principles, including the inherent worth and dignity of every person, compassion in human relations, and acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth. However, we should keep in mind that this success story developed over the course of 2 years through in-person interactions like shared dinners and playing games like pool and Monopoly. And that it occurred just as social media was beginning to take over so much of human interactions, especially among those Gen Z and millennials. Sherry Turkle is a professor of psychology and sociology at MIT. She takes a particular interest in how those disciplines interact with technology. Now, in 1996, she made the cover of Wired magazine and gave a TED Talk touting the virtues of the emerging chat groups and media in bringing people together. But by 2012, she had begun to sound a cautionary note. She wrote a book called Alone Together: Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, and gave a TED Talk that year in which she talked about how social media had begun interfering with human connection and healthy social interaction. The smartphone meant we never had to be away from social media. People were sharing, liking, and retweeting at work, at school, even when socializing with others who were physically present. As a result, the interaction between Matthew Stevenson and Derek Black, seen here, has largely been replaced by this one between Turkle's daughter and her friends. Next slide. There it is. Quite a difference. Thank you, Joan. Fast forward 10 years in 2022, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt looked back at that decade since Sherry Turkle gave that TED Talk and wrote an article for The Atlantic magazine titled, "Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid." He cited, quote, "the intensification of viral dynamics in social media. The like, share, and retweet functions spread posts exponentially. And in response to the data collected about what best engaged users on social media, companies developed algorithms that accelerated the process by pushing content most likely to be shared or retweeted." And he noted, quote, "Research showed that the posts that trigger emotions, especially anger at outside groups, are those most likely to be shared." Now, the notion of viral dynamics and emotions in our interactions brings us to a consideration of time in human affairs. Life used to proceed at a slow pace. I looked it up. Average walking speed is about 3 miles per hour. Horse travel usually tops out at 10, unless you're really galloping along, and horse can't last that long doing that. The same for sailing vessels, about 10 miles an hour. Of course, they would use knots, but for much of history, that was it. Among other things, it meant long distance communication took an equally long time, and that meant there was plenty of time to think about what you were posting in that letter you were writing. But the invention of the steam engine led to the development of railroads, and with them, travel became fast enough that clocks in distant towns had to be synchronized rather than relying on the local sundial for what's called solar time. Standard time zones weren't fully established in the US until 1883. And in the second half of the 20th century, jet aircraft began allowing us to travel long distance so fast that our bodies couldn't keep up with it. We call it jet lag. In the 21st century, computers and smartphones connected through a fast internet allow our thoughts to travel almost anywhere at lightning speed. But is this really a good thing? At times, of course, it can be, but there is increasing evidence that it is having some serious negative effects on society, even national security. That's because time is also involved in our thinking process. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman wrote about this in 2011 in a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Fast thinking, what he calls System 1, is an automatic, rapid response system that includes two variants of what he calls intuitive thought. One, he called it expert. It's a well-rehearsed thing, so that when you're playing a piano, you're not having to consciously think what note you're playing, etc. Now, the other kind is heuristic, Heuristic. It's a kind of mental shortcut that he and his late colleague, Amos Tversky, gradually began to discern during their 14 years of collaboration, beginning in 1969. Their first paper was called Judgments Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. It was published in Science magazine in 1974, is still one of the most widely downloaded papers in all of science. It described the simplifying shortcuts of intuitive thinking and explained some 20 biases as manifestation of these heuristics, and also as demonstration of the role in heuristics in judgment and misjudgment. Slow thinking, what Kahneman calls System 2, is, as its name implies, a slower, more deliberate, and effortful form of thinking. This is the realm of conscious thought. Kahneman writes, when you are asked what you're thinking about, you can normally answer. You believe you know what goes on in your mind, what often consists of one conscious thought leading to another in an orderly way. But he adds that this is not the typical way. Most impressions and thoughts arise in your conscious experience without you knowing how they got there. And he goes on to say, that fast thinking, quote, is more influential in your experience, is more influential than your experience tells you, and is the secret author of many of the choices and judgments you make. Now, I would ask that the fast thinking system one is largely resident in the limbic system, what some call the primitive or reptilian brain. Located at the center of the brain, it is also the seat of emotions and influences the recording of memory such that greater weight is given to painful and traumatic experiences. And thus, our intuitive responses tend to skew toward avoiding experiences which we find distressing or painful. The slow thinking system, too, is in the prefrontal cortex up here, which is more highly evolved part of the brain, but it also takes about 25 years to fully develop and become fully operational, which means that childhood is largely mediated by fast thinking rather than deliberative thinking. It also means that many of these habitual behaviors that we learn don't serve a functioning society very well. It drives a lot of the polarization we're increasingly seeing these days. Now, another book I read recently is called Spies, Lies, and Algorithms by Amy B. Ziegart, professor of political science at Stanford and an expert on intelligence matters. Published just last year, her topic was on how computerization, social media have changed the ways that the intelligence community, what's called the IC, the ways that they must get and analyze information in order to make accurate predictions about the future to serve the policymakers and leaders of our country. She cites Tversky and Kahneman's work in a section called The 7 Deadly Biases. Let's see how many of them speak to today's polarizing conflicts. Confirmation bias. People are wedded to their initial beliefs and will rationalize like nobody's business to cling to them, even in the face of contrary evidence. People tend to seek and latch onto information that confirms their pre-existing belief while avoiding, disregarding, or minimizing evidence that challenges them. 2, optimism bias. Put simply, optimism bias is wishful thinking. Researchers have found that people believe good events will happen to themselves more than others, and that their investments will outperform the average. People also are wildly optimistic about themselves. Large majorities believe they are smarter, more talented, better looking, and even better drivers than average, even though it's statistically impossible for that many people to beat the average at anything. 3, availability bias. People naturally assume that what they can easily recall is more likely to occur, or I would say more likely to recur. The human brain confuses the availability of a past memory with the likelihood of its future occurrence, even when they're statistically less likely, vivid, horrifying events like shark attacks. They're generally easy to remember than more everyday occurrences like car accidents. People have to contend with the risk that availability bias can skew their judgment in hidden ways. What you predict depends on what you've experienced. 4, fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency to believe that others behave badly because of their personality, while we ourselves behave badly because of factors beyond our control. People often jump to blaming others while letting themselves off the hook. 5, mirror imaging. Estimating how someone else will behave by projecting what you would do in the same situation. Framing biases is number 6. Different people perceive the same numbers or words in very different ways. How a question is asked or how statistics are presented can lead to varying interpretations of likelihood or risk. And I would also say that the words that we think we know what they mean, someone else may take a different meaning from them. And finally, one of my favorites, groupthink. Ziegart says this distorts collective judgment, fostering over-optimism, sloppy thinking, and an inflated sense of the group's morality. And this is actually Ziegart talking. It's in me saying, I like this further comment. She said, cohesion turns out to be a double-edged sword. The problem isn't that there's too much friction in the group, it's that there's too little. So how many of those did you think applied to, say, a situation we're close to? So Ziegart also has a chapter on how these vulnerabilities are being weaponized by hostile governments to foment social conflict and weaken our democracy. In that article for The Atlantic, Jonathan Haidt wrote this also. As a social psychologist who studies emotion, morality, politics, I saw this happening too. The newly tweaked platforms were almost perfectly designed to bring out our most moralistic and least reflective selves. The volume of outrage was shocking. It was just this kind of twitchy and explosive spread of anger that James Madison had tried to protect us from as he was drafting the US Constitution. The framers of the Constitution were excellent social psychologists. They knew that democracy had an Achilles heel because it depended on the collective judgment of the people. And democratic communities are subject to, quoting Madison in Federalist Papers, subject to the turbulency and weakness of unruly passions. The key, back to Jonathan Haidt, the key to designing a sustainable republic, therefore, was to build in mechanisms to slow things down, cool passions, require compromise, and give leaders some insulation from the mania of the moment, while still holding them accountable to the people periodically on election day. So I ask you, will cooler heads and deliberative thought prevail in our time anytime soon? I think so, if we heed these lessons. Amy Ziegart wrote of emerging evidence of how the intelligence community is figuring out how to cultivate better decision-making among its analysts. And it sounds very much in line to me with Kahneman's slow thinking system too, and very much in line with our Unitarian Universalist principles and practice. Quoting book, Phil Tetlock, the expert judgment expert, had recently finished a 20-year study explaining how well experts forecasted the future. He found the secret to success, it was how they thought. Super forecasters is the term that came up with. Super forecasters are far more open-minded, curious, careful, and self-critical than the average bear. They believe that reality is complex, that nothing is certain or inevitable, and that ideas should always be subject to evidence, testing, and updating. And she continues, perhaps most encouraging, Tetlock and his colleagues have since found in their experiments that super forecasting skills can be learned through training, practice, measurement, and feedback. Sounds to me like those skills are what Unitarian Universalism would ask us to have, and will be easier to attain if we seek to slow things down. It may take us longer, but by turning to people more than social media, we will be less prone to those 7 deadly biases and more open to reason than emotional responses. And as far as I am concerned, a Zoom meetup like tonight's counts, especially because of the open discussion that will follow the conclusion of this service, and I hope you'll stay around for that. And it's a big reason why I stepped forward to have them continue. So taking more time may seem paradoxical in a society where there's so much hatred and violence directed on a daily basis towards racial and gender and other targeted groups. And it's heartbreaking to bear witness to it and to the erosion of gains previously won. But my contention is that responses stemming too much from fast thinking are more likely to produce a short-term gain and then a kind of backlash that we've been seeing certainly in the last few years and pretty much for many years. Slow thinking takes us past the emotion-driven response and works for the more enduring long-term solution, as we saw in the story of Derek Black. I think Dr. King came to understand that himself a decade after decrying the gradualism of liberals during the Montgomery bus boycott. He said this in a 1967 interview with Sander Van Oker of NBC News. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future, but I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul searching and agonizing moments, and I've come to see that we have many more difficulties ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and it must now be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go. In 2015, Sherry Turkle followed up her Alone Together book with another one titled Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age, in which she, as her TED profile says, argues that now, with a deeper understanding about our vulnerability to technology, we must reclaim conversation, the most human and humanizing thing we do. The virtues of person-to-person conversation are timeless. To the disconnections of our modern age, it is the talking cure. So I will close with an example of how Turkle's talking cure was put into play by a woman named Teresa Reed. As she explains in her 2021 book, You're Likely Not a Racist, Answers for Curious White People. She is currently serves as Dean of the School of Music at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. She is a UU and an African American. This passage is from the book's introduction. She mentions that how traumatic it was. First, the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012, then Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd in 2020, and a more personal race-based death, the 2016 death of Terrence Crutcher, the son of one of her best friends in Tulsa. And then she writes, alongside my expression of pain and outrage, however, I offered hope. Perhaps it was an irrational hope, yet it was and remains a powerful and stubborn hope, grounded in my belief that in every human being, there is a kernel of goodness, however distorted, concealed, diminished, misguided, or camouflaged it may be. I believe the kernel of goodness is there. I have yet to fully heal from the tragic loss of Terrence Crutcher, and I continue to grieve for Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and for so many others killed simply because someone perceived them to be suspicious or dangerous. Their names are too numerous to list here. But my healing has begun. What started my healing was not the protests, marches, or sharing of pain with others who felt the same trauma. Instead, my healing started at the moment when I discovered the power of friendship was stronger than the offense of white racism. In my pain, I reached out to a longtime white friend, and she was brave enough to see me fully in the context of what it means to be a Black person in America. Until that moment, we had talked about many things, but never about race. I didn't know what her reaction would be, but I took a chance. Her loving, compassionate, and empathetic response was what I needed in that moment. She was the reason that I chose hope over hatred. I began to host a weekly series of candid conversations about race every Saturday morning, coined Safe Saturday Conversations About Race. My objective was to create a non-threatening forum where white people and African American people could share their perspectives, learn from one another, and engage in judgment-free, healing dialogue. In those conversations, white people were invited to wonder out loud about everything from interracial relationships to religion and racism, to use the N-word. No topic was taboo. Nothing was off limits. They got to voice their questions without fear of backlash, and Black people answered, sharing their stories with candor, teaching their white colleagues, and honoring their curiosity with information. And she dedicates the book to the spirit of Safe Saturdays. And she says, I am confident that racism can be conquered if we are brave and determined enough to get at the ignorance that feeds us. So in conclusion, I know we have a long way to go, and that we may not get there as fast as we would like, with all the concomitant suffering that implies, but we'll achieve a more enduring community of, as our sixth principle asks us, peace, liberty, and justice for all, if we could add social justice to our social justice cocktail, that tincture of time. Thank you. And now our closing anthem, Life Calls Us On, a wonderful anthem. I think it's a wonderful video. Joan's going to put the lyrics in the chat, and I hope you enjoy it, and then stick around for our open discussion, and the recording will stop before we do that. Hit it, Joan. There we go.
Here in reverence now we gather for the blessings we have known, with a pledge to one another that we journey not alone. Joy and sorrow make us wise, kin to all that lives and dies. Love calls us on. Love calls us on.
Words and deeds of those before us, waken here to keep us strong. Blend our voices in the chorus of creation's living song. Courage bids us lift our eyes upward to the shining skies. Hope calls us on. Hope calls us on.
Loyal guides in love and duty, loyal guides, lead us with a trusted light. Blessed are they whose inward beauty shows the path of truth and right. Honor is their earthly pride. By their work we realize faith calls us on. Faith calls us on. Faith calls us on. Faith calls us on.
We have shared a radiant hour.
We have shared
When the truth has made us free and true.
and the Spirit's gracious power.
Spirit of grace,
Dream of good that yet shall be.
for good. Right the path before us lies.
Is the path. Joyful pilgrims now be
Life calls us on.
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 Life calls us on. Life calls us on. Life calls us on.
Life calls us
Life
on.
calls us on. Life calls us on. Life calls us on. Life calls us on. Life calls us on.
I'm now going to extinguish the chalice. Go in peace to the discussion.